feel your max with Brooks Running and the all-new Ghost Max 2. They're the shoes you deserve, designed to streamline your stride and help protect your body. Treat yourself to feel-good landings on an ultra-high stack of super comfy nitrogen-infused cushion that takes the edge off every step, every day. The Brooks Ghost Max 2. You know, technically, they're a form of self-care. Brooks, let's run there. Head to brooksrunning.com to learn more.
There's atrazine throughout our water supply. Atrazine, by the way, if you in a lab put atrazine in a tank full of frogs, it will chemically castrate and forcibly feminize every frog in there. And 10% of the frogs, the male frogs, will turn into fully viable females able to produce viable eggs. If it's doing that to frogs, it could. There's a lot of other evidence that it's doing it to human beings as well.
Quiet Riot. Welcome, quiet rioters, to Sunday School, the accompanying harmony to our Thursday melody. I'm Naomi Smith.
And I'm Alex Andreou. How are you, Naomi?
I am pretty good, Alex. Pretty good. I'm, as a dog owner, not looking forward to it getting below 0 next week.
Oh, God, is it?
Yes, it's going to get really cold, kind of Tuesday, Wednesday. And I often think of you when the weather turns. Like, how does a Mediterranean-blooded man like you cope with UK winters? Because I will never know, because I can barely cope with them.
I really don't mind winter. I really don't mind proper cold, like sharp, bright cold. I quite like it. I don't love the bit that comes in between. So I don't love it when it's dark. I don't love it when it's drizzly and sleety. It's the in-betweeny weather that I really dislike.
I mean, look, I love summer. And you can get a bad summer and you can get a good summer. But winter every year is reliably horrible. And yes, listeners, I do have one of those light up lamps that wakes me up in the morning. I do get outside every day. I do all of the things that you're meant to do. I mainline the vitamin D3, but nothing is going to persuade me that winter is something to enjoy. It is something to survive. I want to chat about a few things. I think the main thing that's happened since we recorded the live show is the Rachel Reeves Mansion House speech and the governor of the Bank of England joining in to talk about the impact that Brexit has inevitably had on growth. And I think you described him quite well, didn't you? You described him as a Brexit optimist. Is that right?
Yes. Maybe that's a little bit harsh on Bailey. It's just that when he was recruited for the post, we know from reporting at the time that there was a lot of negative vetting, basically. Loads of candidates were knocked off the list for having been negative about Brexit or having campaigned for Remain. And that's a lot of sensible people in economics and finance, because there's very few that think Brexit is a good idea.
Yeah.
So I guess by default, Bailey was seen as a safer candidate because he'd said nothing.
Yeah.
You know, they were interviewed on that basis. And again, from reporting at the time, Johnson chose him, I think he used the words, as a standout candidate because he wasn't glum about Brexit.
I remember at the time of the appointment, all of that reporting about, Johnson's gone for the guy that will be his friend on getting Brexit done and all of that. And contacts of mine in the Bank of England were calling me saying, don't panic, Naomi, he's really not that bad. He's not a Brexiter. Nonetheless, it was good to sort of see that it's becoming much more mainstream to talk about Brexit has hurt the economy, so how are we going to deal with it? Rather than, oh, no, sunlit uplands are just around the corner. Come on, guys.
Yeah, and I think it's notable because he's kept his counsel so far.
Yeah.
And what's been interesting is that it's been almost like a signal to the media that they can talk about Brexit now.
Yeah.
Suddenly, everyone's discussing Brexit and whether we need to get closer to the EU. But it's like, hi, welcome.
You're back. Great. Thank you. And I do like that more and more people of high standing in the world of economics and politics and geopolitics and trade are breaking ranks and saying cakeism is for the birds. We're not going to get both a great US trade deal and a great reset relationship with the EU that suddenly unshackles us from all of the Brexit red tape. It is now received wisdom that if you want to improve growth through trade, you prioritize the deal with our nearest trading partner.
Yeah, it feels like a taboo has been broken, basically, and we can at least talk about it now. Which is interesting because the conversation I had with Jakob Öberg, he thought that might be the upshot of a Trump win. It's by no means certain that this now means, a closer relationship with Europe, but it has at least started that conversation. It has pushed it up the agenda.
Another taboo that I think has possibly been broken this week is criticizing Biden. I'm sort of seeing that taboo broken as well. People are breaking rank and sort of saying, well, he fucked up on this and he fucked up on that, amongst all the good stuff he's done. And I sort of have found that a little bit refreshing. I'm actually going to be sitting out most of today's show, listeners. And that's because Alex has interviewed Arthur Snell on the impact of a second Trump presidency and the impact it might have on all of the major conflicts around the world. And I'm having to sit out also because I have got both baby and dog sitting duties to attend to.
I've told you many, many times, the way of the future is to become a single cat lady like me. Well, I'm not single and I'm not a lady, but I do have cats and they are much less fuss than lovely as Wrigley is. I just cannot fathom my life if I had set times during which I'd have to get dressed and, walk around the park for 20 minutes. That is like torture to me.
And on that note, he is nagging me to take him out one last time this evening. I'm going to let you all get on with it.
The months that preceded the US election in terms of geopolitics looked a little bit like one of those super slow motion fight sequences in The Matrix. Characters pirouetting through the air, bullets advancing as if shot into jelly, debris flying like confetti, conflict suspended. The last 2 weeks have been like the bit that suddenly returns to normal speed and everything crashes to the floor. When Fox News understudy Pete Hegseth was announced as the defence pick, a clip did the rounds of him saying that women should not be in combat roles, and I couldn't help but hark back to Trump's promise to protect women whether they like it or not, unless, of course, they happen to get pregnant. It turns out all the pundits, the apologists, the sane washers, they were wrong. America should have taken Trump both seriously and literally. I spoke to a friend of the podcast, former diplomat and host of the brilliant Behind the Lines podcast, Arthur Snell, about the threat this wacky cast of characters presents to global security. Hi, Arthur. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Alex. Great to be with you.
Right. So where do we start? Shall we start with Marco Rubio?
Yeah.
Now, Rubio is someone, and I think this is quite illustrative. 8 years ago, I would consider Marco Rubio quite a right-wing appointment. His Tea Party, anti-reproductive rights, anti-equal marriage. He called Obamacare a bailout. Global warming, he thinks, is not a result of human activity. Very hawkish on Iran and China. So I think it's a measure of the Richter scale of the earthquake that Marco Rubio is now seen one of the safe, steady hands in this latest slate of candidates. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And it's interesting because, of course, the Rubio one came out first. And as you say, yes, in the traditional Republican world, Rubio would have been seen as definitely on the right of the party. but now he's a moderate by the standards of MAGA republicanism. If you look at his record, he, partly perhaps because of his own life story, he's shown a willingness to work with Democrats on immigration reform, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, I doubt he'll be doing that in the future, but that's in his past. And I think that there's also a point about a CV which looks credible. Rubio, I'm not saying that I think he's a wonderful person, but he's been a senator for a very important state, Florida, for more than a decade.
Yeah,
so
he's an experienced politician.
He looks like a serious person. And because it was the first of the really big announcements, I think, myself included, a lot of people saw that and thought, well, maybe Trump is actually going to try to walk the line between sort of, MAGA headbanger and people who actually have done something with their lives. But as we all know,
how wrong we
didn't
were.
work out that way.
So what do you think that says, actually? The fact that he's got his hand on the main tiller of foreign policy?
Yeah, well, that's the really key question, because if actually some of the more wacko appointments, which we'll obviously go on to talk about, are really there for sort of entertainment value and for trolling the libs, and actually the work is going to be done by someone like Rubio, 3 years from now, one might say, well, it wasn't quite as awful as we thought it might be. But I think on the other hand, Rubio is there almost as a sort of humiliation ritual. There's some sort of BDSM stuff going on here where people who have in the past allowed themselves, in the mildest terms, to criticize Donald Trump must be forced to go on their knees and humiliate themselves publicly. And we know that, Trump is constantly humiliating Rubio. And so I would like to think that what it means is that the State Department, which is clearly a hugely important role, that the State Department will be in the hands of somebody who at least has instincts that are on planet Earth, even if they're not instincts that you and I share. But I wonder whether actually what it's about is Rubio will be forced repeatedly to do really crazy things that he personally hates, but he lacks the backbone to stand up to.
What about Pete Hegseth, who's been given defense?
Yeah.
Now, you might see this and wonder, what does Hegseth offer the U.S. military? And I'll tell you what, great deals.
You see, one-man army loves the country and makes damn good soap. I've used them all, and I love these new brands. Like Gunsmoke, smells like American firepower. Or Gurkha, refined bourbon and tobacco leaf. Or how about Patriot and the Pine Tar Bar? There's more of them, too. You can get them in a variety pack. Each of them shaped like a grenade, soap on a rope. The well-groomed militia. This 4th of July, join it at grenadesoap.com.
Well, first of all, being the head of the armed forces in a way, the president's still commander-in-chief, but he is the managerial head of the armed forces.
Yeah.
And also he's in charge of all the procurement. Putting someone so inexperienced into a position where billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts and negotiations will come through his desk, it seems to me that that is the more significant danger with this one. But I wonder what you think.
Yeah, so Secretary of Defense of what is the world's largest military, by some margin, whatever we hear about China and others, the US is still by miles the biggest military in terms of its budget. If you look through the many decades and even centuries of people who have held this position, you basically have two types of nominee. You have someone who was themselves in the armed forces, general or something very senior like that, admiral, or you have a kind of master bureaucrat, somebody who's had extremely senior roles, probably within the Pentagon, within other parts of the national security system. There is no precedent for appointing a Fox News chat show host. Now, Hegseth has served in uniform, and to be fair to him, he served in combat and he was decorated for his service. So I wouldn't question his valor as a soldier, but he was a major, and that puts you in charge of a few hundred men. And he is going to be responsible for literally the world's biggest military bureaucracy. Possibly you could argue the Chinese is bigger, but I think in terms of the range of things that the US Defense Department does, that nothing comes close. It is simply mind-boggling. I was scratching my head to try and think, are there precedents or anything approaching a precedent? Interestingly, you could make the argument that the person that JFK tapped up to be his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was very young, was a civilian. But let's just remember that McNamara had been in the Defense Department during World War II and in a senior strategy role. But he had also, I mean, he was young, but he was this massive whiz kid. He had basically run the Ford Motor Company, which at that time was one of the biggest companies in America. Pete Hegseth is none of those things. All he is one of these MAGA blowhards whose job it is to say outrageous things on TV and on social media in order to rile up the libs and to motivate the base. He's got absolutely no credentials at all. Now, so asking the question of, well, what does this mean? Yes, I think there are huge questions around procurement because people like this who lack
it will swallow him up, basically.
Oh, totally. But I think even before we get there, he doesn't have context. So he will know a little bit about what it is to be an infantry soldier in a post 9/11 war situation, which, yes, is a relatively significant aspect of what the US has done, but it's a tiny fraction of what the US military is involved in. So it's very possible that he'll start saying, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And try and cancel things that may have extremely important resonances. But the other thing, he has made it very clear, in his sort of big agenda, to the extent that he really has one, is that the so-called woke agenda has taken over the US military and has made it incapable of fighting wars. And, it's this sort of right-wing culture war thing applied to the military context. So he said very clearly that he wants to fire most of the senior officers in the US military and make sure that there are no women either in combat roles or in senior officer roles. That is weakening the military. I mean, it's a purge. It's not the kind of purge that we will have been accustomed to seeing in Soviet Russia or Maoist China, but it's still a purge.
And after several decades of women in the military, it's a purge of potentially quite experienced people as well.
Absolutely. And then the other thing that I think we're all trying to understand a bit more about is, to what extent is he actually a white nationalist or a sort of Christian fundamentalist? There are these stories about he has these tattoos. I don't know enough about tattoos to know whether the certain cross that he has on his torso can be anything other than a fascist tattoo. Maybe it represents evangelical Christianity or whatever. But what I do know is I've seen him making a speech in Israel where he talks about rebuilding the temple. Now, what that means is knocking down the Dome of the Rock, so one of the most significant mosques in the entire Muslim world, which is, if you want a shortcut to an epic war in the Middle East, that would be a way to do it. So the guy who has the Crusader tattoo and then talks about bulldozing the Dome of the Rock, that to me points to more than just slightly right-wing MAGA. He may be in another category altogether of a kind of end-of-world millenarian Christianity. So the thought that this guy should be anywhere near anything that matters, I mean, the Fox News sofa sounds like the perfect place for him. And it's terrifying to imagine he might end up running the world's most powerful military.
And this is a post that Trump has had a lot of trouble with before. I think it's worth mentioning that whereas most presidents will have one or two secretaries of defense per term, I think Trump managed to go through 7 last time, although one was twice. It seems a recipe for extreme instability.
Quiet, Riot. The reality is, guys prefer naturals. And if it's natural body wash you're looking for, Dr. Squatch has got you Natural Kings covered. The ingredients? Naturals. Scent options? Naturals. Around-the-clock moisturization? Naturally. Now available in-store and online at drsquatch.com. Dr. Squatch Body Wash, for men who prefer natural.
I wanted to touch on Matt Gaetz, not because he has a direct impact on foreign policy, although he does in that, it's the Department of Justice that decides whether arms exports in certain contexts break international law or don't. But I think as a signal as well, it declares an intent to just bulldoze over legal objections of any kind. And I think that is significant in the context of foreign policy. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think it's telling the world that the rule of law is not a concept that we recognize. And what we recognize is the rule of those that are in power.
Yeah.
And that's the hallmark of a weak state, of a quasi-autocratic state, or certainly of a state whose writ you can't really rely upon. I mean, certainly the main impact of a Gates Attorney General would be domestically, no doubt about that. But of course, there are global impacts because US justice has always had this extraterritorial element to it simply because they're so powerful that very few countries would, for example, be willing to ignore an extradition request from the US. So Matt Gaetz, one of his main jobs will be to go after people that Trump perceives as his enemies. Some of those may be American citizens who've decided to leave America because they don't feel comfortable in a Trump world. We've all heard the stories that Jack Smith, the prosecutor who was bringing charges on Trump's election denial cases, people saying that he should be arrested. Now, obviously, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think we can assume that Gates will, in order to demonstrate his loyalty, will be wanting to show his boss, and this is a sort of mafia system, show the Godfather that he's loyal by sending extradition requests, by sending out arrest warrants, by being sort of ultra provocative, but also ultra loyalist in the way that he does that.
It's interesting that you mentioned the mafia, because I think my fear is that what this is setting up for is effectively for the federal state to be run as a criminal enterprise. And the most worrying aspect of that is that there is a perverse logic to Trump's main contention, which is, why are we treating the rest of the world as if they are partners? They're not our partners, they're inferior, and we should be squeezing them basically for protection money.
Yeah.
If you look at it purely from the point of a businessman that's basically got 4 years to make as much money and get as much power as possible, it makes a weird kind of sense to say, we should be bullying the rest of the world because we can.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. There are specific material benefits that accrued to the Trump family from his first presidency, most notably Jared Kushner's relationship with the Gulf countries. But I think because Trump, he has no interest in a thing that he doesn't know about. He would never ask someone to tell him, to explain to him something he's not familiar with. So he can only understand the world from his perspective. And his perspective is this very crude kind of real estate deal maker. The thought that a settled global trading system is good in general terms for American businesses just doesn't make sense to him because he can't see, well, where's my direct advantage? How am I winning and how are you losing?
The final one I wanted to touch on, my favorite one, I think, is Tulsi Gabbard.
Ah, yes.
As Director of National Intelligence.
President Biden has not been the guy calling the shots. He has not been the guy making the decisions, nor has it been Kamala Harris, for that matter, nor will it be if she is elected president. It is this cabal of the woke warmongers, those in the administrative state.
Presidents Putin, Zelensky, and Biden. It's time to put geopolitics aside and embrace the spirit of aloha, respect, and love for the Ukrainian people by coming to an agreement that Ukraine will be a neutral country.
Again, when you have powerful people who think they are God, and they come across someone or confronted by someone who is trying to serve the one true God, they react in the way that demons react.
Now, listeners may remember that Tulsi Gabbard was the subject of a particularly funny wokey dokey only 12 weeks ago because she is an actual conspiracy nut. There's no other way of putting it. When Ukraine first came under attack from Russia, Gabbard said that it's an undeniable fact that the US is funding bioweapons labs in Ukraine, repeating Kremlin propaganda. She was skeptical about Assad's chemical attacks. She's questioned Japan's military spending because of World War II. She has expressed doubts about 9/11. She's a believer in the deep state. She's sort of QAnon adjacent. What does this mean Arthur for Five Eyes. We share intelligence with the people she will be overseeing. And perhaps even more importantly, we rely on the intelligence that they share with us.
If you're living in America, in the US, I can understand that probably the Gates appointment is the one that troubles you the most. But I think
RFK Jr. If I lived in America,
yeah.
I think RFK Jr. would worry me the most. That really doesn't impinge on foreign policy so much.
Yeah, but certainly if you're in the wider world, this Gabbard one is mind-boggling. You wouldn't give someone clearances to work as a security guard with this sort of backstory.
Yeah.
I mean, just to lay it out there are many serious people including, I was only this week talking to very, very senior officials in the government here who haven't decided whether or not she's a Russian agent. I mean, this is the level we're looking at with Tulsi Gabbard. And it's so crazy.
Please tell me you're going to do behind the lines Tulsi special. I really would like to listen because it's quite a story, isn't it?
It
really,
is quite a story.
From sort of growing up, it's quite a story.
And if you sort of put into any search box Tulsi Gabbard Russia, what you find is that there has never been an occasion where she hasn't taken the Russian line on any given issue. And as you've obviously described, Alex, she also took the Syrian line. Syria, basically a puppet state of Russia these days. She denied that Assad used chemical weapons when there's really not in doubt. And anyone who makes that denial is, needs to explain why they would make that observation. She's appeared on RT, the Russian propaganda channel. She's been funded by a US-based businesswoman who is openly pro-Russian.
Yeah.
At one point, Hillary Clinton suggested that she was being groomed by the Russian state as a sort of target of opportunity.
I mean, when she stood for the Democratic leadership, because part of her extraordinary backstory is that she was a Democratic congresswoman
a presidential
for Hawaii.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she tried for the presidential nomination, was knocked out very, very early. And that is really when she started to spin out of control, ended up a very regular Fox contributor there, ended up with her own show on Fox, and then she moved on, obviously, to her own conspiracy podcast.
Yeah. What is not in doubt is that the Russian state views her as an agent of influence, by which I mean they view her as someone who reliably shares and
takes their side.
Yeah. Now, whether or not that is an organized thing and she's obviously, I don't know. But I mean, that the fact that we're having this discussion, and we go back to your question about the Five Eyes, for someone whose job is to superintend the intelligence agencies of the United States.
The FBI, the CIA.
Right. She's there overlooking the crown jewels of Western intelligence.
I know I shouldn't laugh.
No, but I mean, in a way, you have to laugh because it's so mad.
What else is there to do?
Yeah, it's so mad that you try to ask yourself, well, what is Trump trying to do here? Now, we know he hates intelligence agencies because he thinks they framed him on his own relations with Russia. So obviously, he's trying to give the middle finger to the US intelligence agencies. He's obviously doing a wider thing of sort of telling the average MAGA voter that we're draining the swamp, these tired cliches. But there's a fundamental issue, which is, and I think it's similar with Hegseth at Defense. There is no way that these people can do their jobs in any normal function. They have no ability, background. I mean, Gabbard, at least Hegseth served in uniform. He was in a couple of wars. Tulsi Gabbard has never worked in intelligence for a single day of her life. And just in case people are wondering, the current DNI, Avril Haines, fairly young, fairly inexperienced relative to the job, but she was the deputy director of the CIA and the deputy national security advisor. So if you're looking through her CV, you can sort of see how she ends up doing the job she's now doing. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard is a wacko podcaster. Yeah. We're just in a completely different world.
As the appointments were coming through, you could see sensible international observers and diplomats who are, their job is to keep their counsel and measure their words. sort of go, look, America has chosen democratically, whoever is appointed will have to work with them, blah, blah, blah. And Tulsi Gabbard is announced, and everyone did like a sharp intake of breath, because it's like, we're now in a completely different universe.
Totally.
Is there any logic to Trump's picks, you think, other than they're just the people he loves now and they will troll the libs? Could there be a kind of shock and awe element so that his relatively less controversial people get through? I'm just thinking that if the other 11 picks were sensible and Tulsi Gabbard was in there, Senate would really concentrate on knocking her out. But if you put 5 picks in there that are really, truly objectionable, then Senate has to pick its battles and say, well, look, we can't refuse him all of his appointments, because that will look like we're attacking the democratic choice of the people.
Yeah.
So is there a sense where he's going full pelt at this, knowing that maybe 2 or 3 of those will not get through?
That's the big debate now, is sort of trying to understand, well, one, will the Senate confirm in the normal way? And I think the answer for that is certainly not Gates, who's extremely unpopular because of his disgraceful personal behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that he's obviously a scumbag. So there's no way that he would get confirmed that I can imagine, even taking into account the slavish loyalty that goes with the MAGA movement. So then there's a question, are these just stalking horses that are there, that they get knocked down, and then Trump puts in someone who is nuts? But compared to Gates or Gabbard, you sort of think, oh, well, thank God for that, Or the alternative, and I'm sure, Alex, you've been reading these things too, is that what Trump is trying to do is actually create effectively a new precedent for the norm, which is these so-called recess appointments.
Yeah.
Basically, that if the Senate isn't sitting for some reason, you don't need approval for your appointments. Because in a way, that plays into this autocracy thing, that what Trump is saying to his senators is, I need total uncritical loyalty, which he gets from almost all of them. There's maybe 2 or 3 Republican senators.
2 or 3 are enough to give him bother, though.
Because actually, their margin is very narrow. And so then he responds, well, if I don't have total loyalty, I will rub your faces in it by appointing these people whichever way I feel like doing it. Now, that to me feels more in line with all the things that Trump has been saying in his campaign and with what we understand of his psychology.
Quiet Riot. This episode is brought to you by Netflix. From the co-director of Shrek and the visionary behind Toy Story comes Spellbound, a magical new animated adventure starring Rachel Zegler, John Lithgow, Jennifer Lewis, Nathan Lane, and Titus Burgess with Javier Bardem and Nicole Kidman. When a powerful spell turns her parents into monsters, Princess Elian must journey into the wild to reverse the curse before it's too late. Watch Spellbound, only on Netflix November 22nd.
What do you think the implications of this are for, let's start with Ukraine, Arthur, which I know is a topic very, very close to your heart.
Yeah, I think it's bad for Ukraine. I know that there are people trying to find the light, trying to see whether or not there are upsides. The basic problem is twofold. One is that Europe has not been able to develop an industrial base that allows it to support Ukraine without a lot of help from the US. So if you take the US out of the equation, Europe might have plenty of money. I mean, we can argue about that in sort of domestic politics terms, but clearly compared to Russia, the countries of NATO and certainly of Western Europe are way, way, way more wealthy than Russia. But we don't have the industrial base, so we can't keep the Ukrainians supplied with weapons. There is a very consistent line coming out of the Trump camp. They think that too much money has been spent supporting the Ukrainians, that somehow the Russians have some validity to their claim. I mean, obviously, I think that's complete bullshit, but that's a line that is consistent, and it not just from Trump, it comes from Vance. Even Rubio has criticized Ukrainians, and so it's there across the board. I actually get a bit impatient when I see people trying to sort of pick up these little crumbs of optimism. Oh, but on one occasion, Rubio once said that maybe we should support Ukraine more. Look at the vast mass of what everyone's pointing at. Look at Donald Trump Jr., rubbing the face of the Ukrainians and saying that Zelensky's going to lose his allowance, as if Ukraine is just this kind of annoying kid, needy kid who's always asking for cash. So I think what it means is that Trump will try to force some kind of ceasefire on Ukraine and Russia and force Ukrainians to cede a lot of territory to the Russians. Now, the only thing that might stop that from happening is the fact that actually the Russians are currently making advances. So if you're Russia, why would you agree to a ceasefire when at the moment your army is moving forwards? So what I can't quite work out is what the timing on all this would be and what Putin's thinking might be, because he knows he's got his friends in power now in Washington, but that doesn't mean that he's going to do what they say. And, rather distressingly, it seems to be the other way around, that Washington is dancing to Moscow's tune. So if I were Putin and there's talk of a peace negotiation or something like that, I would sort of say, well, yes, that's very interesting. Let's explore the idea whilst continuing the really quite rapid advances that they're making on the ground.
There's also, I think, a hell of a lot of rewriting of the past. And I mean the slightly more distant past, which annoys me. I'll mention it. We could do an entire episode on it. But there is this revisionism that goes along the lines of America has been taken advantage of by Europe, who has used it as its protector with American taxpayer money, etc., etc. Countries should step up their defense spending. They should be reaching that NATO threshold, and they haven't done for a long time. All of that is fair. What is not fair is to say that since the 50s, really, America has been paying all that money to protect Europe. I mean, that is just an ahistorical and economically illiterate view. America stepped into the role of leader of the free world for incredible strategic and economic advantages that yielded. And it involved Europe in a multitude of conflicts around the world that had nothing to do with European security. It just bugs me, and I need to put it out there. America got the dollar made as reserve currency in exchange for paying most of the defense spending for NATO. That's when the dollar became the world's reserve currency. So let's not say that the last 50 years have been a display of altruism.
No.
They have been an arrangement that worked for everyone involved. That's what
I'm glad you raise it, Alex, because as you all know well, when you start to dig into this endless argument about did the Europeans spend enough on defense? Well, now in 2024, with a very threatening Russia, no, many countries don't. But let's just take a random example. Greece has always spent a lot on defense because it's threatened by Turkey. So, you have those case studies. And then people go on about Germany, but for several decades after World War II, there were extremely clear reasons why Germany was not spending a lot on defense and why people wanted it that way. So, I mean, and then finally, of course, the American defense budget, a huge amount of that is dedicated to things that have no link to European security. So, yes, I think there's a basic argument that
Europe should step up.
Europe should step up.
That's fair. Europe should
but
step
the
up.
idea that there's been this sort of freeloader thing, as you say, going on for decades. Look at the Korean War, where I live in Gloucestershire. The local regiment was heavily involved. They were there on the Imjin River with the Belgian contingent. What did the Belgians have to do with Korea? But that was an example of how Europe has become involved in other people's wars over the years. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of historical illiteracy that goes into that.
What do you think it means for the Middle East, and especially Netanyahu's stance to the region?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, because one of the lazy assumptions that people might make is that Netanyahu and Trump get on well because they're both populists and they both have this rather anti-democratic approach and so on. But actually, they don't have a good relationship, partly because Netanyahu congratulated Biden on winning the election, which he clearly won in 2020. But of course, to Trump, that's an unforgivable crime. It's very clear that Netanyahu at the moment is trying to create facts on the ground in the lame duck presidency, and he knows that no one is going to stop him up to the point of the Trump inauguration. I wouldn't be surprised if actually once Trump is in, He wants to slow them down, not because Trump gives a damn for the rights of the Palestinians or the Lebanese, but because America's spending billions of dollars supporting Israel. And Trump doesn't Trump sort of sees this as his own money, and that in itself tells us something. So I don't think Trump is giving Israel a blank check. Having said all of that, when you bring in Hegseth, this new defense secretary, he's one of these people who sees the modern Middle East as something that is lifted from the pages of the Bible, and he takes a sort of Christian millenarian view. So that does mean that if, for example, Netanyahu decided to annex the West Bank, I don't think anyone would try to stop him. So I think the big wars, particularly the Lebanon one, might get toned down. But I think what we'll see is an intensification of the sort of pressure on the Palestinians. But I haven't mentioned Iran. And I think this is the one area where Trump was willing to deploy American force. He launched a strike that took out Qasem Soleimani. Iran hawks are everywhere in the Trump world. Now, again, I don't think America's going to join a war on Iran. I don't think there's any American soldiers anywhere near the ground. But what I think you might do is you would see American helping the Israelis continue to strike Iranian nuclear facilities and things like that.
And I think the other way as well, like, if there's any area where Trump's main selling point, that having a sort of dangerous, unpredictable strongman in the White House makes other strongmen around the world think twice, I think the one area where that might be the case is Iran. I think Iran will be looking nervously at a second Trump term and maybe beginning to wind their neck in.
Totally. I think that's correct.
Any thoughts on Taiwan? So, I mean, when I last spoke to Kim Darroch, I remember he said to me that Trump is, of all the presidents in the last several decades, he's the one that has the most ambivalent position on Taiwan.
Yeah. Trump's wider thought is, why should America expend any resource or effort in anyone else's security? Because he's got this very narrow transactional mindset. He can't understand how it is helpful to America, even though it doesn't seem very complicated to most of us. We can't understand why it is helpful to America to have Taiwan continue to exist in freedom. So I think bluntly, you can't imagine Trump deploying a single US Marine to defend Taiwan, but perhaps more significantly, I don't think you can imagine him deploying the US Navy in any role that puts them at risk, at serious risk, to prevent a blockade of Taiwan. But of course, what's also interesting is that on China itself, he's very hawkish. And, Marco Rubio is extremely hawkish on China. Now, Trump's hawkishness is in the trade field. We know about this plan for tariffs. But I just wonder whether, I'm sure he will start with the imposition of some very extreme tariffs. And that's going to be a starting point, because, again, his negotiating style is to set fire to the building and then sort of say, how much will you pay me to be allowed out? And I just wonder whether Taiwan will get swept up in some grand deal that he tries to make with the Chinese, because I don't think he cares at all about freedom for the people of that island. So it's about whether or not there's a wider deal to be struck.
Yeah, it's interesting. On one hand, I think he wouldn't care if Taiwan was lost. On the other hand, I think he would care if it was lost to the Chinese. So will be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah.
What about Musk freelancing?
Yeah.
I mean, again, these are things that if I were reporting them a year ago, people would think that I'm writing some dystopian fiction.
Yeah.
So Musk is now apparently in communication with the Iranian ambassador and was there during the call to Zelensky.
Yeah.
What the fuck is that about?
We're in this extraordinary situation where Musk clearly doesn't lack self-confidence. I think Musk believes that he is an absolutely core part of the kind of functionality of the Trump administration, and that he is effectively empowered to perform whatever tasks he feels he should perform. Now, I'm sure that isn't what Trump thinks, but, Musk has sort of appointed himself in this regard. I would imagine that quite a lot of people in MAGA world, I don't know if this extends to Trump or not, but quite a lot of people in MAGA world are pretty unhappy about the meeting with the Iranians because they don't like Iranians. Iran is not big enough to be worth expending political capital on, I'd argue. You know, they've got oil. Yes, they're important in the Middle East, but not like China. There isn't some grand bargain that you can then sell to the world. And particularly now that they're very much on the back foot with the Israeli pressure that's being put on them. So the Musk story ends with him and Trump falling out in a
for sure.
But I suppose that the question is how and when. And this sort of freelancing,
spectacularly and quickly would be
probably.
I mean, there are definite Johnson Cummings vibes there.
100%. 100%.
Big egos. The massive difference being that Cummings didn't have real power. Musk does have real power.
That is,
he's filthy rich and controls a social media platform. Where do you think the UK should be in this, Arthur? There are, broadly speaking, I would say 3 schools of thought. Cleave closer to the EU immediately. This is a great opportunity to play Trump against the EU and get a deal or exemptions to the tariffs and things like that for the UK, or try to maintain a sort of equilateral distance so that you can act as a mediator between these 2 big powers. Where are you instinctively at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all fantasize the sort of moment where Starmer plays the role of Hugh Grant in Love Actually and humiliate Trump on live TV. We have to be realistic, and particularly those of us of a left liberal mindset, that we have to have a good relationship with America. The thing that we're not doing enough of, and which clearly now the requirement seems to me becomes stronger than ever before, is building institutional connections to Europe, and that might extend to trade. Now, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about, but maybe this is an opportunity for us because Trump will threaten tariffs. We can stand apart from Europe. We've got the ability to make our own choice and get a great trade deal with America. I would just say 2 things to that. One, Trump is never going to give a great trade deal to anyone. And if you look at the progress of trade deals during the Trump presidency, they are extremely limited.
Yeah.
And secondly, what makes you think that what looks like a great trade deal that Trump grants you would get it through Congress? Because again, we've just talked about congressional appointments and so on.
Oversight, yeah.
Yeah, and Congress has to agree to trade deals. And Congress is even more protectionist, arguably, than Trump, because you've got all these senators from different states with special interests and all the rest of it. So I just think the thought that we can hang on for a great offer from the US, the idea that the US will give us a better offer, which you can take to the bank, I think is for the birds. And so I think we have to accept that the brief experiment of Britain having an independent trade policy, which will have lasted about 5 years, has proved to be a failure. And we have to go back into the customs union and hopefully eventually the single market. Bluntly, I don't think all that Trump does is a reminder of the fact that the US is increasingly hostile to Europe.
Yeah.
And a post-Trump presidency could be worse. There's no reason to assume that it resets to the cuddly consensus that we've been used to.
It reemphasizes the point that there are 3 big economic blocs in the world, and you want to be in one of them. It really is as simple as that. So if I were to summarize your position, it would be, don't piss anyone off, but work hard behind the scenes to begin to Trump-proof institutionally as much as you can. Is that a fair?
I think that's very well summarized.
And who do you think as UK-US ambassador would be best placed to operationalize that?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. On one level, I'm a bit disappointed that the speculation around political ambassadors makes an assumption that it has to be a Labour politician. I actually think that David Cameron would do a great job. I have no idea whether he's interested, and we know that he got on well with Trump. He went down to Mar-a-Lago, talked him round a little bit on Ukraine. He's got that sort of veneer of quasi-royalty that appeals to the people who like gold toilets. So, why not?
Honestly, you are such a bitch. It is occasionally very hard for me to fathom that you're a straight man.
But I don't think he's on the list. Back in the real world, it seems like a lot of people are talking about Peter Mandelson. Clearly, Mandelson is a hugely talented politician, immensely experienced. Let's not forget that he was involved with EU trade matters as a commissioner. So it's not just his role in New Labour, but his CV is overflowing. My only thought is that he is the kind of global elitist that the Trump people, certainly in public, love to hate.
Yeah.
But I just wonder if there's a risk that he looks like Davos Man and the MAGA movement hates Davos Man.
Arthur, this ended up being a bit of a mammoth session.
There's so much to talk about.
But I think all of it was actually really, really interesting. And just because I've been watching a lot of American network of late, I'm going to say I appreciate you as they tend to do on them. Thank you, Arthur. Thanks for lending us your brain.
My great pleasure, Alex.
And that's it for this week's Quiet Riot Sunday School. I hope you enjoyed it.
And I hope you feel as intellectually nourished from listening to Arthur and Alex as I do. If so, please do consider signing up to back us on ko-fi.com/quietriotpod. But if you're counting the pennies, don't worry. Just please do leave us a review instead.
Plus, we're posting most of our content on Blue Sky now, with very little on X, so make sure to be following us on quietriot.bsky.social.
Thank you for tuning in, and we're going to see you again on Thursday, or maybe a little before. Bye.
Definitely before. Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot. You have gained notoriety for your skepticism about vaccines. And over the summer in an interview you said, quote, "There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective." Do you still believe that?
I never said that.
So stop me. We have the clip. Please play the clip.
Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.